Alright, now we're starting to get into some of my favorite parts. Next up is the tail box and tail hub. As you can see, this does come pre-assembled from the factory, but I promise you there's no Loctite or anything, and there's no grease on those thrust bearings. So we are going to tear it all the way down. There's really not a whole lot new here. When I get it tore down, I'll run you through all the components just for those of you who may be new to Synergy, but it's pretty straightforward. This tail box is reused from the E5 and N556 torque tube. There is a little difference to the tail output shaft. I'll explain that to you when we get there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop and break this guy down. Okay, as you can see, I've got everything torn down and ready to be reassembled. One thing, just like in the front transmission, this mushroom gear, there's nothing to Loctite there, so I didn't bother to force this out and risk being clumsy and messing up one of the bearings. There's no reason to, but you do want to give it a good push and make sure that it's fully seated on the bearings. Sometimes in transit I've seen these guys get walked out a little bit or not fully seated, so just make sure it's up against the bearings. Inside here there are two radial bearings and a spacer, just like the front transmission. This is an 18-tooth rear mushroom. When you're ordering gears, be very careful. Strongly recommend you have the manual handy. The rear transmission gears and the front transmission gears are different. The same tooth count, but the shape and application of the gears are very different, so make sure you get that right. As you can see, pretty straightforward. You've got two side blocks. There are shims that go on either side of the output shaft and the output shaft spacer. We'll talk about those in 1 second. The pitch slider on this helicopter is another carryover from a lot of other Synergy models. This guy is pretty straightforward. This little locking ring holds the brass insert. As long as that is assembled properly from the factory, you shouldn't have to take it apart. But what you want to check for is to make sure the brass is fully seated and that lock ring doesn't have any play in it. So this one feels good. This is the one thing I do want to note is this bell crank ball that goes to the tail bell crank is into plastic, so you're going to want to make sure you CA that. Epoxy wouldn't be a horrible idea, but if you ever have to replace this, CA is more likely to come out without damage in that and reuse the ball. But definitely at least CA. Don't Loctite that. Loctite just going to corrode the plastic. Use CA or epoxy. This is also the most opportune time to size these links. These links are molded, and while the tolerances are extremely tight, you're definitely going to want to use your Bodo sizer, which I will have to dig out of the toolbox here in 1 second. I think I put it up. But this is the opportunity to size these links. It's much easier to get to this ball and this link to make sure everything is put together and moving freely and drag free while you have loose pieces. Just a nice little tip. I'd size those down. Next thing we're going to talk about is the changes to the tail output shaft. For the first time, Matt has gone with a hollow tail output shaft. Shaves a few grams of weight. It is still a beefy 6mm output shaft. Because of it being hollow, though, there are two changes to the rest of it. The set screw that goes down inside the end to hold the bevel gear pin is now an M3 set screw, which is nice and beefy. Same principle applies to the front transmission. I'm going to run that set screw all the way in and out, make sure I can see the threads in the hole to make sure there's no assembly gunk down in there, prevent it from tightening it up. The other thing is different is the tail hub set screw now goes all the way through and bottoms out to the back side of the shaft. So the set screw on the tail output shaft is significantly longer than it used to be. The tail output shaft itself is the same, tail output hub rather is the same, but that set screw is now quite a bit longer. So you're going to want to make sure it goes all the way through and bottoms out against the back side of the output shaft. So that's pretty straightforward. It's kind of neat. Nice to see Matt trying some new things. The tail rotor rather is pretty straightforward. You've got an inner and outer radial bearing with a thrust bearing in the middle. Typical helicopter assembly there. I mean, you want to make sure the inner and outer races are oriented properly, and the grub screws are Loctited. I use blue Loctite there. I've never had one come apart. Also, make sure that you Loctite the balls to the grip. It's very important. And then when you're assembling everything, you would definitely want to use a healthy amount of Bodolube or some other high performance, high pressure synthetic grease on the thrust bearings, because When this tail is doing 10,000 RPM, there's a lot of pressure on those grips to swing outward. The thrust bearings are what allow it to rotate while under those loads to adjust your tail pitch. If you don't have a good synthetic grease there, it's going to bind. I've seen tail wags. I've seen bad stops. I've just all kinds of tail characteristics because of mechanical problems from not properly lubricating thrust bearings in the tail. So everything's pretty much laid out. I'm going to just stop the camera, reassemble everything, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Alright guys, tail box is back together. Tail box, tail hub, it's all together. I didn't say it on the camera the first time, I'm going to say it now. You got to make sure you Loctite these balls. I always use red Loctite on all of the linkage balls just because they do have some rotation force on them when they're operating, and I just like the peace of mind to know that they're not going to back out. But it does make it a little bit hard to do some maintenance sometimes, but I figure that's a better headache than having the helicopter go into a major crash because something backed out. So red Loctite on all of the linkage balls. Tail's back together, it looks good. All that's left to do with this guy is put the tail fin on, which I can loosely do now, but I can't really Loctite it until I've got it on the boom, and I'm not quite ready for that step yet. It's getting close, but we're not there yet. One thing I want to point out, unlike a lot of the other, the past two Nitro torque tube models Matt's done, the transmission on this guy isn't upside down, therefore your tail rotor is back to turning counterclockwise. Don't fall into old habits like I started to with this one and think Nitro Synergy is going to turn clockwise, and I almost put my tail grips on backwards. So pay attention to that. This is a counterclockwise tail. You're going to want to make sure you check the orientation of your tail grips, make sure you got leading edge control. I did properly size these links. There's absolutely no resistance. You can see it's just flipping around in my hand. No resistance on those links at all, and that's going to be good. One last thing I like to note, since this might be a first-time Synergy build for some of you guys, if you notice these tail hubs move in and out, these tail grips rather, that is on purpose. There's a little bit of lateral movement there. There's no axial, there's no radial, it's just lateral. That is there on purpose to give the thrust bearings time, pressure relief to release when they need to. Don't shim that out. If you shim that out and don't have it 100% perfectly even, you're going to have a tail vibration. So leave that there. That is on purpose. For the last few revisions of the helicopters, Matt has added these grease ports to the tail grips, which is really nice. And if you happen to be a fan of Botolube like I am, find the camera here, the needle fits in there perfectly, and you can re-grease your thrust bearings without pulling the tail grips apart. The head grips have those grease ports as well. So on the front and the back, make sure you shoot some grease into both sides. I don't know, I do it like once a flying session. I don't really keep track of the number of flights, but keep some fresh grease in there. All set together, everything but the tail fin bolts are Loctite and ready to go. This guy is curing. He's going to sit and cure. Not quite ready to mount that yet, so I'm going to set it to a side, and we'll move on to the next step. Alright guys, next up is one of my favorite parts, the main rotor assembly. There are a couple things to note here. This is the same rotor assembly that was introduced with the 516. It is taking a beating and is overly built for the 516, and it's a perfect fit for the 556. There are some things here that were different for the 516 and now the 556. As you can see, the head is slightly skeletonized to shave some weight where it's safe to. The head is still solid CNC aluminum, nothing cast. All the areas that need to be beefy are still beefy. Nothing comes down to a small point. So we shaved a little weight by skeletonizing the top, but the real load carrying parts of this hub are still very solid. No problems there. Also on the grips, they got a slight machine here and there to save a couple of grams where they could. Like all the other Synergy helicopters, the pitch arms are serviceable and replaceable. Aside from the spindle, the most common damaged part in a head is the blade grip. And if they were milled into the blade grip pitch arm, and if these arms were milled into the grip, you'd have to replace the whole grip. It'd be a lot more expensive. So having those being separate is a nice touch. This is what we call a rocking spindle. There is a pivot point in the middle made of Delrin with dampers on each side. The pivot point it allows the disc to flex on the dampers without allowing it to float up and down. It's a nice touch. That was actually introduced with the E5 and then carried over into all of the models. That has been a proven nice addition to the head. So we are going to take a second and we are going to break this completely down. As with everything in the box, these are assembled strictly for parts verification purposes. There's no Loctite, there's no lubrication. Do not act on the urge to just throw some grease in through the grease ports and fly this. This is not flight ready. Tear it down. We're going to tear it all the way down, Loctite everything. As I said before, I like to use red Loctite on things that will cause a crash, so I will red Loctite the pitch arms on. I will red Loctite the swash ball to the pitch arm, but I will use blue Loctite on the spindle bolts. Those guys are beefy, got big threads. Red Loctite would make that extremely hard to get apart, and let's face it guys, it's a helicopter. It's going to crash eventually. You're going to need to change the spindle at some point. Do yourself a favor. Use a quality blue, use the correct amount, don't go nuts, and make your life a lot easier to maintain it. So I'm gonna stop the camera, break it all down. I'll come back and show you briefly the one of the blade grip internals. It's standard thrust bearing in and out of radial bearing stuff, but I will show it to you. So when I get back, we'll have it all tore down. All right, as you can see, I've got the head completely tore down. Now I'm gonna tell you, this is an opportunity where a position where having the correct tool will save your neck. I've had a lot of customer complaints that the Synergy spindle bolts are just super tight from the factory. Now I'll be honest with you, I like it that way. Even though you hear me talk about it in every video I do, and it's on every forum, it's in the manual, it never fails. I promise you, somebody out there is going to give a shot on those spindle bolts. Assume they're, oh man, these are really tight, screw it. I'm just going to spray some grease in and go fly. Matt's factory does torque these bolts down pretty good, but as you can see, there ain't a lick of Loctite on that bolt. So do not break this head down. All I do to get the spindle bolts out is I break them loose with an angle Allen in one hand and an Allen index in the other, pop them loose. That will inevitably only loosen one screw, but then I got my handy dandy redneck grippy. There's a lot of spindle wrenches out there. This one's from Bobby Watts. I love this guy. This spindle wrench will then allow me to hold the spindle, prevent it from rotating, while I pop the second side off. And it's ready to go. Again, having the correct tool will make your life a lot easier. So invest in some good metric angles, a good metric Allen index for the second hand, and it's really not a big deal. As promised, I'm going to take you through the grip mechanics real quick. You have a standard radial inner and a standard radial outer. There's a shim that goes between the radial and the outer bearing race for the thrust bearing, outer thrust bearing race, thrust bearing cage, and then inside there, I'm not going to press that out because I don't want to risk messing that up, but down inside there is the inner race. Now I am going to check to make sure that the outer race is correct. If it's not, I have on occasion had these where the factories put them together backwards. Then I will have to get that race out of there, but I got lucky. Fortunately, the factory does a really good job of making sure these are correctly oriented 99.9% of the time, and I did not have to take it back apart. There are also these two 1mm shims. These actually might be 0.75. Let me grab my caliper and check. Yeah, these are 1 mil. So there are two 1mm shims that go between the inner radial bearing and the damper. That's the part of the adjustable preload. There are alternative head shims in the extra parts bag if you want to adjust the preload. I think Matt's done enough experimenting with the preload on the dampener and the dampener bowl and the usage of which shims here that I think the preload's perfect out of the box, but you know, everyone has their preference. These dampers do need to come out and be lubricated. I'm going to warn you with the 516 and then this hub as well. The damper cup got a little bit tighter so that there's a little bit more preload on the outer edge of the damper. It's just helping them last a little longer. So it is a little bit of a trick to get those out of there, but it's time well spent. If you properly lubricate the damper, properly lubricate where the shaft goes through, it is going to make for a worry-free, wobble-free head. So it's well worth the effort. Make sure you do that. On these washout arms, you want to be very, very careful. There is a M3 screw going through here and a set screw on the back side of this swash adapter link, you do need to make sure you take that set screw out and Loctite it so this link adapter doesn't come apart. But while you're doing that, be very, very careful, because here and here are two 0.1 tiny 0.1 millimeter shims. The purpose of those shims is to put a little space between the washout arm and the head block. If you don't have those, the washout arm will actually drag on the head block. It can cause some problems. So make sure when you're working on this, you don't lose those shims. I'm going to go ahead and stop the camera, Loctite all the parts, properly lubricate the thrust bearings, get it all back together, and when I come back, I'll have a head that is ready to put on the model. Alright guys, there it is, all complete. One thing I did not mention in the last step, but I did go ahead and do it, is these are molded links just like on the Swash to servos and the pitch links and the tail control rods. You definitely want to take your Bodo sizer and size these links so there's no drag on the balls once you get it all together. Again, red Loctite on the pitch balls as well as the pitch arms, blue Loctite on the spindle bolts, lots and lots of Bodo lube on the dampers and the thrust bearings. Head went together beautifully. Red Loctite on the set screw holding the link adapters in. This head is ready to go on the model. Next step is the Swash Plate. Now this Swash Plate will look familiar to you. This is the completely serviceable swash that was initially introduced with the 766, which has been adapted to the 10mm main shaft of the E5, E7, N7 as an upgrade, and the 516 has a slightly different version, smaller of course, and then the N556 has it now as well. So this has got no Loctite or anything. You see these these balls aren't even tight. I can take it all apart by my fingers. We're going to tear this guy all the way down, and I'm going to show you all the pieces and parts. Alright guys, I've got our serviceable swash completely torn down. Swash Plate consists of all the usual suspects. You have a large outer ring, which is where the inner bearing actually is. This is where the servo to swash links balls go on, and your anti-rotation pin. The inner ring is actually two pieces that sandwich the bearings. Inside these upper and lower rings you have these Delrin bushings, and the hind ball is made of Delrin. One thing to note on this guy, the upper and lower inner swash ring is held together with 8 of these 2 by 16mm bolts. Now there's 8 of them to provide plenty of strength to not allow any slop in the inner ring. But they are 2mm, so it's very important that when you're reassembling these, you cannot Gorilla these. They will break. I've had more than one customer complain, "Oh, my swash is broken." Well, it's because you Gorilla monkey wrenched them down. These require a quality Loctite, a little bit of it at that, and just finger tight. I'm going to show you here in a second. Just finger tight. You don't have to monkey these down. Let the Loctite do its work. I'm going to go ahead and I prefer to tear it all the way down as you see, because now as I put it back together I can apply the appropriate Loctite. If you pull apart one bolt at a time, you could miss one, you get distracted. I always break it all the way down, put it all the way back together. There's zero chance that I missed something. If I did miss something, it's 100% my fault. So bear with me one second. I'll come back and show you the swash. I'll leave one of these 2x16s loose so I can show you how I tighten those. As promised, I'm going to show you how I do this last 2x16. You definitely want to put a little bit of Loctite on there, but little is the name of the game. You want to have the appropriate amount. You want there to be some Loctite there. You want it to be evenly distributed through the threads, but you do not want to gunk it on there. It doesn't take a lot. Now I'm going to push this down in here, and I'm literally just going to use these 2 fingers. Obviously it's going to spin down for most of the way by itself, and then when it gets to the bottom, I'm just going to give it a little squeeze. That's all there is to it, guys. Finger tight. There are 8 of them. They hold there's plenty of pressure there to hold together. Appropriate amount of Loctite, all 8 finger snugged. It's not going to come apart. But now if you need to pull those apart down the road sometime, you're not going to have them break on you. So at least the odds are very much in your favor. Now I'm going to go back to putting the inner swash ball ring, outer rings, and the anti-rotation pin with red Loctite. Good note, I did use blue Loctite on those 2x16s. I need to be able to get them apart down the road without breaking them. So just a very little bit of blue, but I am going to use red on the swash balls and the anti-rotation pin because, again, I use red anywhere that could cause me to have a catastrophic failure. So a little bit of a little bit extra, work for me if I ever have to do any maintenance. But again, I'd rather have a little extra work on maintenance than have carelessness cause a expensive crash. So bear with me. I'm gonna put the swash the rest of the way back together. Alright guys, there are all of the rotating assemblies. The swash plate, the main rotor hub, and the tail hub and tail box are complete. That wraps up tonight's video. We're gonna keep this one short. Tomorrow we tackle electronics and electronics placements. We might even get far enough to talk about how I'm gonna do for head setup. If not, there will probably be a fourth video that talks about the final setup. But this video got us through basically the rest of the build. The frame's together, the clutch stacks built, the engine is set up. That video was yesterday. The first video on night 1 was the main frame build. We're getting really, really close. I hope to be flying this thing this weekend. Thanks for hanging in.